Kia ora koutou, everyone. We're going to make a start, and a few people may continue to join us, but we're on a pretty tight time frame, so let's get underway. Ina mana, ina reo, ro rangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Barbara Annesley toko ingoa, ko te kai rangahau, o Kore Hiakai o. I'd like to welcome you to this online symposium on food security, and thank you all for being part of this event. I'm Barbara Annesley and I work for Kore Hiakai as a researcher. And our hope is that this symposium provides a space in which you can share your knowledge and you can learn from and connect with others. Those who are here present online come from a wide range of organisations, including tertiary institutions, research and not-for-profit organisations, and government agencies and DHBs. We have a lot of ground to cover over the next couple of hours, so let's get underway. I'll start by giving you a brief outline about how the symposium is going to run, and then we'll have a mihi whakatau from Wayne Parker, who is Kore Hiakai's po Maori. Trish Malcolm, sitting next to me, is the po Arahi of Kore Hiakai, and she's going to tell you a little bit about our organisation, which some of you may not be familiar with. We then have the first of our three speakers, Dr. Sarah Garrettson from Auckland University. Sarah's presentation will be followed by a breakout discussion. You've each been allocated to a breakout group and you'll be automatically placed into that group at the appropriate time. Each group has a facilitator who will welcome you and introduce the topic and facilitate the discussion. Our next two speakers are Christina Mckercher from the University of Otago. I think she's based in Christchurch, and we also have Professor Louise Signal, also from the University of Otago and based in Wellington. Each of the presentations will be followed by their presentations will be followed by the discussion in your breakout group. And just a reminder to keep your video off and mute your microphone during the presentations, and then to turn them on again for the breakout discussions. If you could also make sure that your name that's showing up on the screen accurately reflects who you are, just so we know who's in the room. The presentations will be recorded, but the breakout discussions will not be. But we are asking each group to spend a few minutes at the end of their discussion to identify some key points that they'd like to share with the wider participants, and we will use those in an attempt to kind of sum up some of the key themes from the breakout groups. Then we'll close with some information about next steps and follow-ups, and a karakia whakamutua to close. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Wayne, and we'll get underway. Kia ora koutou.
Tēnā koutou. Kui runga, kui raro, tū te here tangata, e nuku ārangi. Ke puāranga kai rau, ke matariki a hunga nui. Tō mata tini me pā ki roto, tō mata tini me pā ki waho. Ke horohia te kura, ke kura nui, he kura roa, he kura takatū mai, e rongo takitaki. Ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te ao. Ka rongo e tahi ka roa, e tuārangi, te whakeeke nei. Ka whakeeke te huakai, ke tīna. Ka whakeeke te huakai, kia tōka. Ka whakeeke te huakai, ki uroroa. Whiti, whanotau mai te Maori, humie, huie, taiki e. Mea tūtahi, he mihi ki tātua nui, o te rangi, me ngā mea kato. Te mea tūrua, he mihi ki ngā kai kōrero mo te hui nei, tēnā koutou. He mihi hoki ki ngā kai whakarongo, o tēnei huhunga kei runga Zoom. Nau mai haria mai e wanganui a tātou, ngā iwi o ngā hui e whā. He mihi ki ngā kai whakahaere mo tēnei Symposium ngoi ana hau, te taumaha o tēnei mahi, kei te mihi ki ngā kai mahi o Kore Hiakai, me ngā kai tautoko te rōpū, te community research. Ara, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Me hatu te mauri tēnei wā ki te pauarahi o Kore Hiakai, Trish Malcolm. Tēnā koe, Trish.
Tēnā koe, Wayne. Kia ora koutou, kia ora tātou, ki tēnei hui. It's a real privilege to be able to sit with all of you today and to take some time together to pause in this point, and it seems quite timely to do that as part of Matariki, and we chose Matariki quite deliberately to place this Symposium, as Wayne has taken to calling it, in order to pause and to reflect both on where we have been in our journey around food security and food insecurity, but also to collectively stand in this space and dream and vision where we might move forward. We know in Kore Hiakai that we choose to stand in one place and hold fast to the thought that we could, someone's not put their mute on, sorry. We choose to stand in one place and hold fast to wanting something to change because we know that there are a significant number of our community that experience food insecurity. And we know that we do that, but we can't do that together. And so we have taken this moment in Matariki, just as the stars are very plentiful, so are all of us in this space quite plentiful, and we each play our role in order to guide our country, to guide our communities into a new way of being so that all might be food secure. So who is Kore Hiakai? Kore Hiakai is a group of social service organisations who have come together to work collectively to bring about some change. We have a dual purpose to work with community food organisations so that whatever we are doing in food and community can be mana enhancing and can be able to meet the need that is within our community in the best ways possible. But also we are here to do the long, slow, deep work of addressing the root causes of food insecurity so that all might be food secure in Aotearoa. So it's our privilege to have you with us on this journey, to share your wisdom, to hear some things that might inspire and provoke us, but also to share the wisdom that we bring into this space together. And I'd just like to finish my piece with the Pākehā translation of the beautiful words that Wayne wrapped us with this morning. This is a piece that has been written for Matariki by Ben Naia of Te Atiawa. Woven from above, woven from below, interlacing our fundamental virtues to be in balance with the celestial and human realms, Te Puanga and Matariki bringing forth aspirations and generosity. May your divine countenance be imbued inherently, maintaining itself through the community, so that good will be prepared. May it be strong and enduring, an enduring gift established on the pillar of peace, resounding through times of hardship and in times of abundance. Resounding are the fires of ancestral connection from times immemorial that ascend forth. May the gifts shared from one to another be upheld. May the gifts be affirmed. May the gifts sustain life, and may it be enduring. Proceed forth with hope, bringing balance to our lives, bringing people together as one. Kia ora tātou katoa.
Kia ora. Thank you, Trish, and thank you, Wayne. I think those are really inspiring words, particularly around the gifts, and I think we're sharing the gifts of knowledge with each other today. So I'd like to introduce Sarah Garrettson, who's our first presenter. Sarah is from the School of Population Health at the University of Auckland. She's a social scientist working in the field of public health, nutrition and child health, and she is the Associate Director of the Growing Up in New Zealand longitudinal study, which is a pretty amazing piece of research that is helping inform policy. The study is following over 6,000 children from before birth, and it's still underway now. So Sarah's research areas include food security, food environments, and healthy food policies, and she's going to share some of her findings with us now. Kia ora, Sarah.
Sorry, it just took me a while to unmute myself there. Kia ora koutou. Lovely to see you all, and thanks so much for joining us today. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Kore Hiakai, for organising this. Like, what an amazing group of people being brought together at this wonderful time of year, so thank you. In this quick presentation, which is only lasting 15 minutes, so I'll quickly set my timer so I don't go over. So I know we're on a tight schedule today. I'm going to just take you through the definitions of food insecurity that we use in Aotearoa and what we know about the levels of food insecurity among children particularly. My research is nearly all on children's experiences. So as Barbara said, I'm working with Growing Up in New Zealand study, but previously I did work for the Ministry of Health and the New Zealand Health Survey. So I'm going to draw a lot on that work as well. And just kind of put it out there about what do we know about how COVID-19 has changed this situation, because we haven't seen the data yet, although there's a lot of indications out there. And I'll go through that actually the situation is only getting worse for our children in whānau. So, and then I'm going to end by talking about what's the impact of food insecurity on children's health and well-being, and particularly look at that middle point of their nutrition. So in my mind, the food insecurity happens, which affects their nutrition, which then goes on to affect their wider health and well-being. So I'm going to talk through that. I've put up some of the publications that I've drawn on for this presentation, and when you see the slides, there's links that are attached to those, so you can look them up too. And I just wanted to help us to remember that these are real children and their families while we talk through this. So I've included quotes in the green boxes throughout these slides, which come directly from children who have been interviewed by in research that was done for the Office of the Children's Commissioner. So feel free to read those as we go through as well, just to kind of go with the data. So if you're not so much of a data person, just go straight to the words of children themselves. So in 2015, the New Zealand government signed up to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And the second one there relates to improved nutrition and achieving food insecurity. It's called the End Hunger Goal. So in that, we have a definition given to us from the international community about what food insecurity is and food insecurity itself. So that's the green circle there, which says adequate access to food in both quality and quantity. So that's how they've defined food security. We probably have a wider definition than that in New Zealand, but that's what the FAO and UN say. So, and then moderate food insecurity is the orange circle there, which is people experiencing moderate food insecurity face uncertainties about their ability to obtain food and have been forced to compromise on the quality and or quantity of food they consume. And then severe food insecurity is people experiencing hunger, so they've run out of food, and at worst, they've gone a day or days without eating. So that's the indicator and the way of measuring food insecurity that's used by the United Nations. In New Zealand, I'll talk a bit more about our definition that the Ministry of Health uses, but they found in 2015-16 that 1 in 5, 19% of children aged 2 to 14 were living in households with moderate to severe food insecurity. And that's lower, they said, than what was experienced in 2012-13. That's really the first time we had measured it in a holistic way or a broad way of food insecurity. So before that, there were food bank figures, things like that, but that fluctuates quite a lot. So it looked like things were getting slightly better in 2015-16 compared with 2012-13. And we don't yet have the figures for 2019-20 and 2020-21, which is when this has been measured again. But Ministry of Health tells me they will be released later this year, so we'll look out for that. So how the Ministry of Health defines food insecurity is that, or food security, sorry, is that when a household has access and availability to nutritionally adequate and safe foods, that we have the ability to acquire such foods in a socially acceptable way, so there's no shame or stigma associated with it, and we have the ability to meet cultural needs with foods,
So hosting and gifting foods. You can hold a birthday party, for example. And this is measured with an 8-item questionnaire in the New Zealand Health Survey at kind of irregular points so far, like I've alluded to from 2012-13. We've repeated that same 8-item questionnaire in the Growing Up in New Zealand study at 8 years of age. So as Barbara said, we've been following over 6,000 children from before their birth. They're now 12 years old and we're about to start interviewing again, and we'll repeat that 8-item again questionnaire. So those 8 items cover whether or not the family can afford to eat properly. So it's actually the mother or primary caregiver's interpretation of these questions, so how they view things. So can they afford to eat properly? Does food run out in the household? Do they eat less than they would like to? Do they have, is their variety of food limited? Do they rely on others for food? Do they use food grants or food banks? Are they stressed about not having enough money for food? And are they stressed on social occasions? So that covers the wide range of these 3 bullets up here about the different aspects of food security, what we'd want to see in New Zealand. Previous to 8 years of age in the Growing Up study, we had the NZI DEP, which is the New Zealand Deprivation Index for individuals. So that's another set of questions asked to mothers of children. And there were 3 items in there which we've investigated in detail about being forced to buy cheaper food to pay for other things, made use of special food grants or food banks, and gone without fresh fruit and veg to pay for other things. So those are other dimensions of food insecurity, and perhaps a smaller definition than what's used in the health survey. So what we saw at 8 years of age, the data we've analysed so far, we can see that about 60% of families in areas of high deprivation are saying that they can always afford to feed their family properly. But then there's the remainder there in the dark blue and the grey, ones that sometimes or never can afford to feed their family properly. And then in the bottom graph here, we've broken up the remaining 7 indicators, sorry. So where the food runs out, that they eat less, that their variety of food is limited, that they rely on others, or they use food grants or food banks, that they're stressed or not having enough money, or that they're stressed for social occasions where they need to provide food. And what we know from both the health survey and the Growing Up study, the analyses of that early data, is that children who experience food insecurity are much more likely to come from deprived neighbourhoods, have low household income, supported by government benefit, live in a rented home, either in public or private housing, increasingly the private housing, so just over half of all households who are food insecure lived in private rentals, that they are more likely to be Maori or Pacific ethnicity, though 57% of children in the Ministry of Health data who live in food insecure houses are Pākehā, so this does affect across the different ethnic groups in New Zealand. They're more likely to live in larger households, so we know that having more than 2 children increases the risk of food insecurity. And we have an indication from Growing Up that perhaps food insecurity is more likely to occur when children are younger. So our 9-month-old children had higher rates of food insecurity than the older ages of 4 years. And possibly this 8-year data we're just trying to compare now, even though the measures aren't directly comparable. But it looks like that first year of life after having a baby is quite stressful for a household, which probably makes sense for us who've been there. Around the low income, so this does seem to be the driving factor behind food insecurity. And what we found in the Growing Up data was basically if the household had less than 50,000 per annum as their income source, then they were, as their total income, sorry, then they were much more likely to have food insecurity. And I guess the main thing I wanted to get across to with these statistics is that we know families move in and out of food insecurity. So these cross-sectional New Zealand Health Survey results don't always give us the picture of exposure, what we call exposure in epidemiology, for children to this incident. It's not the same families at every point in a child's life who are experiencing food insecurity. So this is quite a detailed figure I've just pulled from the report, the food hardships report we did for MSD. And I've tried to make it simpler by putting these boxes over the top, which have the summary figures rather than what's in the actual report is the breakdown by ethnicity. So if you're interested in that, feel free to go and check it out. But what this shows is that back when we interviewed the families when their children were 9 months of age, that first circle, which was in 2010-11, there were 12% of families then saying that they had used a special food grant or a food bank in the past 12 months. So that's quite high. And then by the time we get down to 2013-14, when they're 54 months old, so that's 4.5 years of age, there's only 8% of families who are saying that they used a special food grant or a food bank in the past 12 months, which is closer to the national figure. But that's not the same families. So 450 of that 733 at 9 months of age who were experiencing food insecurity weren't by the time we got to 2013-14. So they'd moved out of food insecurity. And the square down the bottom there on the bottom left is showing those that have moved in or come into this, this state. So that's 224 new families who were experiencing food insecurity at 4.5 who didn't have it when their child was a baby. And there's only 5% of families who that was the situation for them at both time points. So this is something just to keep in mind, because what we're seeing is that childhood exposure to food insecurity is greater than what it looks like when you look at these cross-sectional figures of 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 children experiencing food insecurity. So this graph here shows that across that preschool period, from 9 months to 4.5, over 70% of Māori children and over 80% of Pacifica children had been living in a house where their mum said they were forced to buy cheaper food to pay for other things. That's those 2 darker bars on the left there. And it's nearly 50% in the other, or up to 60% in the other ethnic groups as well. The middle bar there, the green one, is made use of special food grants or food banks. And so that's 35% of Māori children's families and 40% of Pacifica families, children's families, sorry, who had made use of a special food grant or food bank in that first 5 years of the child's life, 16% overall. So this exposure across childhood is just something we can build on as well when we've got the 8-year data and the 12-year from growing up. And there are indications that, and I know you've seen it in your work out there in the community, that food insecurity has probably worsened due to COVID-19. Data has been collected by the Salvation Army on this, showing the food, just tracking their food parcel distribution, and I know other community groups have as well, which builds this picture that there was this big spike during lockdown last year where we saw the queues of people waiting for food. And also MSD have released their figures showing these special needs grants have really increased as well. And I wanted to draw your attention to this idea of a K-shaped recovery from COVID, which Toby Morris has outlined brilliantly in his spin-off series. So check that out if you haven't seen it already, but showing how, you know, some people are coming through COVID actually doing quite well, and our economy overall looks pretty good, but that's maybe hiding the inequities and the inequality that is coming out of the pandemic too, where some people have been hit much harder than others. So what effect does this have on children's nutrition? Well, in the growing up data, we found that children who are experiencing food hardships, and we use that term because we're doing a sort of subset of food insecurity, which is a much larger concept, but those who had the food hardships of having to use food banks, the mum reported having to buy cheaper food, or they didn't have a wide variety of fruit and vegetables. They were they said they couldn't buy fruit and vegetables, sorry, because they needed to pay for other things. They were much more likely to experience these indicators of nutrition, good nutrition really. So they'd They were more likely to have stopped breastfeeding before their first birthday. They were more likely to have had fewer serves of fruit or vegetables at 9 months of age. And they were more likely to have tried unhealthy foods and drinks before 9 months of age. Also, the variety of fruit and veg at 4 years of age was limited, and they were more likely to have consumed soft drinks. So this led us to kind of think about, are these children more susceptible to this wider obesogenic food environment? Because even when we adjust for the socioeconomic position of these children and the families, so in their families, we take that into account in our modelling, we still see the impact of food insecurity on the unhealthy food and drink intake particularly, and the low variety of fruit and veg. So this food environment we're living in, which is characterised by ultra-processed foods, really easily accessible and highly marketed junk food, does seem to be having a greater impact on those children who are experiencing food insecurity. And so I just wanted to kind of bring your attention to that and we hear this from children themselves. So that quote in the box here, that families have to turn to cheap food like takeaways. We know it's cheaper and it's easier as well for parents to make healthier choices when they've got money, right? But money buys you choice. And this does have a flow-on effect for the relationship with child health as well. Internationally, the research on this is quite mixed, the relationship between childhood obesity, and food insecurity. But in New Zealand so far, all of the data that we have available has shown a link between food insecurity and childhood obesity. So Atta's work and Jennifer Atta's work from the youth survey showed that our adolescents are much more likely to be overweight or obese if they indicated that they had food insecurity concerns. And the Ministry of Health's work as well shows this, particularly for younger children. So we'll also be exploring this in growing up. And then there are a range of other things which I don't really have time to go into, sorry, because I'm out of time, but that you would have seen this in the lived experiences as well of children, that it's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation, because I'm sure these things, spiral as well. So we're currently exploring psychological distress and depression amongst children at 8 years of age who are experiencing food insecurity. So we'll have that information out later this year. And we have a lot of really good measures in growing up on bullying, and which is widespread in the cohort, unfortunately. But the impact of food insecurity on bullying is something I'd quite like to explore. So if you're interested in a master's or a PhD, I'll hook you up. So thank you very much for this opportunity to share this work that's been done over the last few years, and do check out these publications if you'd like to know more. Thanks heaps to the funders of this work as well, which are written down the bottom. So kia ora tātou. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think that's given us a lot of, don't want to say it, food for thought in terms of the discussion that we're now going to move to in our breakout rooms. So Dan, our technology wonder person, is going to seamlessly move us into those groups. Your facilitators have a few prompt questions, but really we just want you to reflect on some of the things that have come up in Sarah's presentation, how they resonate for you, the kind of questions and issues they raise, thinking about things like how we measure what we know, and how food insecurity impacts on people's well-being. To turn off your mics and videos for our next presenter, and that is Christina Mckercher, who's a lecturer in Maori health at in the Department of Population Health at the University of Otago. Christina is a trained nutritionist, and she's of Ngāti Kahungunu Tūhoe and Ngāti Pro descent. Her research interests include public health nutrition, food security, and Māori health. And she's recently just completed her PhD on the topic of Māori, of food availability for Māori children and adopting a rights-based approach. And I think I'm hoping that's what she's going to talk to us about today. So I'm really excited to hear what she's found. Kia ora, Christina.
Tēnā koe, o tira tēnā koutou katoa. Tuatahi me mihi au ki a koe Wayne, o tō karakia ki te timata i a tātou I tēnei ata. Me te mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. This is just amazing. It's lovely to be among people that share the same interests. I'm just overwhelmed actually, and I know that there's many people listening who actually I'm a tiny bit whakamā to present in front of, because I know that many of you completely understand these issues in a very deep way. So I hope I can share something useful. But just a little bit about me. I'd just like to acknowledge my Ian Cranwell, who's from the Wairewa Runanga there for that photo of his tuna that they gather out on Banks Peninsula. So I live, even though I actually live in Ōtautahi, Christchurch. So if anyone's listening from Christchurch, kia ora. But even though, how can we make the slides? Oh, there we go. So I've been actually asked to talk about Māori experiences and responses to food insecurity and implications for system level change to achieve a food secure Aotearoa. I think Sarah's presentation covered quite well the experience and definitions of food security that we use in New Zealand. And I have 15 minutes, so I'd really like to structure my presentation a little bit towards the responses to food insecurity, because I think some of the things that our Māori community are doing are, quite amazing. But firstly, a little bit about me. So my grandfather, Whare Isaac, that's his marae there, Iripeti marae. It's in Ruakituri, and you can see our mountain Matakuhia in the background. That's in the Urewera Ranges. So my grandfather was kahununu and tūhoi, and he grew up there at that marae with a large mara and eating a lot of the kai that was from that area, especially the kai from the bush, really, and also eels from our river Ruakituri there. And then my grandmother, Maud Isaac, was Iri Tukura Rua Taupare from Ngāti Porou. So all of my grandmother's marae all face the sea, and my grandmother, she again grew up with a large garden and knowing about the moana and tangaroa and being able to gather that kind of kai. So my grandparents were both based in Gisborne, and kai was a really important part of our existence. I didn't actually grow up in Gisborne, I grew up in Invercargill, but we were lucky as kids that we were able to go there a lot with our grandparents. And I just wanted to say, I think we have always as Māori valued secure and safe food supply. I did kapahaka as a kid, and my teacher was from Ngāti Porou, so we learned a lot of waiata from Ngāti Porou. This is a mōtiatia, which is a lullaby you sing to a child. So this is an old one. Pōpō e tangi ana tama ki te kai mā, nā waiho me tiki ake ki te pau a Hāukai, hei a mai te pakakiki tara hei waiu mō tama. And the entire song is to soothe the child who is wanting food and saying all the different ways in which food will be brought to that child. It goes on for about 5 minutes, and it talks about the kumara being brought to the East Coast, the Baiha Kirirangi, the gardens that were there in Gisborne. And it talks about actually this time of the year, the mātahi o te tau, when food is abundant and available. And I think Indigenous people, I looked a little bit about rights to food in my PhD, and I think our rights, Indigenous people's right to food, is actually inseparable from other rights to whenua and territories and resources and culture and self-determination, or tino rangatiratanga. And when you look at some of the literature around Indigenous people and food sovereignty, there's sort of a worldwide movement. I ended up reading a lot of papers from Canada and Alaska and South America. So I don't think the Indigenous people's right to food is not something only in New Zealand. It's quite a worldwide thing. And I thought it was really great how Sarah went through the different definitions. And we had a chat in our group about how you define something, then sort of ends up what you're going to do about it. And I think it is interesting that in New Zealand, we do in our definition of food security talk a little bit about the need for food to be culturally appropriate and about people being able to share kai. Food sovereignty is sort of another related issue to food security, but I think it's a little bit more about the degree of control people have over a food supply. There are definitions from via Capanisa. I'm resisting the urge to get Madeline Schelling on right now to talk about the exact definition of food sovereignty. But this is one here about Māori food sovereignty by Jessica Hutchings, who is a researcher who has studied this area quite well. And she's written books about Māori food sovereignty and Māori soil sovereignty, which is the practice of ensuring food secure futures for whānau, independent of multinational and national food systems and in harmony with Tao Tūro, the natural world. So yes, it is about whānau having access to safe kai, nutritious kai, which is also produced locally and free from chemicals and pesticides. So food security and food sovereignty are slightly different concepts. And I thought what was wonderful about Sarah's presentation was the exact data. So this is just the last, I was trying to find actually, Sarah, the latest stats about food insecurity as measured by the Ministry of Health. This was one I could find from the Child Poverty Indicator report in May. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that Māori experience food insecurity, and so do Pacific. And I thought what was actually really interesting about your presentation, Sarah, was that also, you know, many Pākehā experience food insecurity as well. You know, 57% of the children experiencing food insecurity are Pākehā. And one of the things I've sometimes wondered about is if this hasn't like been a team of 5 million issue, and that it's been slightly racialized, and maybe if it was tātou katoa, then might be more sort of action. And I think food security for Māori is a very political issue, but that is actually not a new thing. And Madeline Schelling in our group that we were in talked about food security for Māori as a result of colonisation. And so that image there it's actually it's in the shape of half a canoe, and it's some eels and some flounders in there, and that's at Papawai Marae in the Wairarapa. And Papawai Marae was really a part of a food sovereignty movement, not food sovereignty, a sovereignty movement, Te Kotahitanga, in the 1890s, where Māori were fighting really to try and have your own parliament because of the government doing really tragic things. At that time, it was around the Māori Land Court, individualising the title of land, making it easier for land to be appropriated. And that particular carving there is sort of mourning the loss of Lake Wairarapa from the local people there, kahununu there. The lake was drained, and it meant that people no longer had access to all the kai that they used to gather from that lake. So I think it would be fair to say Māori have probably been through a nutrition transition, and that's a quote by Barry Popkin, who has researched this area, where traditional foods and food habits get progressively replaced by the globalized food system, often because of things that are completely out of our control. For example, that's a photo there from the beach in Christchurch about the water quality of the beach and not being able to gather kaimoana, but that's because of the City Council's decision to have sewerage quite close to that beach, which is not a decision that the local iwi necessarily agree with at all. So some of these things are really political. And this was from if you look at any of the Waitangi Tribunal claims, the historic claims for pretty much any iwi in any part of the country, there will be something about the loss of a lake or loss of a wetland or something that impacted on the traditional economy of the people and the way in which they could gather kai. This is just one from where I live in Christchurch in Ngaitahu, and a quote that Ngaitahu were really the losers in a conflict between two different economic systems with different priorities over the natural resources. On the one hand, Ngaitahu relied on their traditional economy and expected their rights to mahinga kai would be reserved to them. And on the other hand, the Crown saw that Ngaitahu economy must not prevent the needs and demands of land settlement, and the agricultural and pastoral demands won the conflict. And so, you know, we have a lot of farmers in New Zealand and today. And actually, it kind of is crazy that we are having a discussion about food security and insecurity in New Zealand, because, you know, on our farms, apparently we produce enough food to feed 40 million people. So it's when you think of it like that, it's like, how come all that kai we produce here is exported? How come there's not enough milk, for example? It's kind of a bit crazy. And I think, but those environmental issues around the destruction of the environment, making it really hard for people to gather kai, is no matter where you look, there's going to be a local issue. That one is just about taranaki, people lamenting the loss of their eels. Again, Ngaitahu taking court action over the water because of the loss, because of the fresh water, and meaning that people can't gather kai from a lot of the fresh water in the South Island. Even that's about deep sea oil drilling that was a few years back with the whānau Apanui protesting that because they didn't want Tangaroa to be affected and their rights to gather kai moana to be affected. And again in Taranaki, not wanting seabed mining, again because of kai. Oh, well, also around the protection of Tangaroa and the moana, but kai is part of it. And in terms of how important gathering traditional kai is to Māori, this is from the Te Kupenga survey, which is something that New Zealand Stats do. And I couldn't copy the entire slide, but I did find that 41% of Māori still gather traditional food. But if you look across to that yellow column, it says 79.9%. So that's saying 80% of the time, gathering traditional kai is something people do as a whānau. And then again, growing your own fruits and vegetables, many people placed a high importance on that, 60%, but often it was a whānau activity, 72.5%. And those were the stats I could find actually about traditional kai and Māori. But I guess just the loss of traditional kai being an outcome of colonisation. There was a survey done by Te Atawhai o Te Ao, who are a Māori research group, and it was called the Whakapiki survey, I think. But they were actually measuring racism in New Zealand, the Māori experience of racism. But one of the questions, they had a set of questions around access to traditional kai and traditional knowledge around that. Almost, I guess, as a marker of, successive governments not really caring enough about this source of kai for Māori. So yeah, 32% of Māori felt a deep sense of loss when they couldn't harvest or buy Māori kai, and it was worse for older people. And I'd just like to acknowledge Gabriel Baker there and the spin-off where I've copied that article from. So I do think the racism is a factor in why Māori people experience food insecurity. This, you know, these cartoons, I don't want to sort of spend too much time on them, but these were the cartoons that appeared in 2013 with the Breakfast in Schools, the launch of that program, where food insecurity was very much being conceptualized as an issue for, you know, poor brown people rather than tātou katoa. So so the issue does tend to get a little bit racialized. But I think we took a very quick look, and Louise, when she talks, is going to go into a lot more detail about the wider enhanced research. But so that was understanding, of course, income is a key determinant of food insecurity. But it's sometimes hard when you're working in the food security space. You know, you're not necessarily the government and you can't increase people's benefits, or, you know, you're not employing people. So what we looked at was some of the other things that communities were doing in this space. And so my job was to run the Māori specific workshops. And I remember I was, you know, doing a focus group in Wellington, and there was someone there who was sort of like, well, what about us? And what about our people? And what are the kinds of things that we're doing? So we did a literature review in 2013, and then we kind of just looked at some of the things. And ever since then, I've got this little file in my office about all the different things, but it's kind of getting really huge. And I know Jeff Keter's on, and I think he's been doing some mapping. So I think he should maybe share that a bit later. But it's a huge area. So I'll just talk broadly about a couple of things. Oh, there we go. There's the article about it. And I know in Louise's presentation, she's got the exact article. Yeah, we wanted to know the role of traditional kai in enhancing food security for Māori. And I just want to talk a little bit about some of the community-based initiatives that we found. We found a huge amount of whānau and communities and marae being involved in mara kai, gardening. Gardening either at the marae or gardening, for example, within people's households. And this is something I saw on stuff with Kelly Francis, the whenū warrior in South Auckland, and being involved in gardening programs. And sometimes it comes from sort of an environmental perspective. So yes, it is about kai, but it's also about being tangata whenua and getting involved a bit with whenua. And it's also a little bit about sovereignty too. Because Kelly was involved in the movement in South Auckland, Ihu Matao. So food sovereignty sort of equals political sovereignty. And I know, for example, in Taranaki, Ruakere Hond wrote this great article about why people get involved in mara kai. And yes, it is about kai, but it's also having a reo space, or a place where you can learn those karakia and those tikana associated with kai. And in some gardens that he wrote about in his article were actually on disputed land. So being able to plant kai on disputed land was actually being able to say, actually, this land is land that, you know, we have a whakapapa relationship with. So there's lots of reasons why people get involved in gardening. And this is just a fund here at the moment in the South Island with the Whānau Order Commissioning Agency, Te Pūtahitanga o Te Waipounamu. It's a little fund whānau can apply for in order to get gardening, hunting, gathering, foraging, producing, preserving, and preparing kai. And I remember talking to Helen Leahy, who's the head of the Whānau Order Commissioning Agency, and they funded sort of some social enterprise things for many years, and she was just going, everybody is obsessed with kai. Everybody is usually doing for their social enterprise something to do with kai. There we go, there's Pūtahitanga there. But also just to acknowledge, like within the Whānau Order response, the way in which I know, especially in the South Island, all those agencies involved in Whānau Order totally mobilized over COVID-19 to be able to get kai to whānau who needed it. And they also, they had incredible networks with the Māori communities. So it was awesome. Also, some of the things in South Island, this is something Ngaitahu were doing with the Christchurch City Council around mahinga kai, getting the gardening going, thinking about the rivers and what kinds of kai is available from the rivers. So trying to make the rivers more healthy so that you can get the whitebait and the eels back. And also wanting to elevate mahinga kai as a design principle within the Christchurch rebuild, so that there would be activities to make sure you know, city planners think about things like white bait. And oh yeah, they've got a whole lot of videos on their website there, which are interesting to check out. I'm a bit worried I'm spending a little bit too long, but other things that I think iwi are involved in with kai moana is mātaitai, which is on the coastline where you don't allow commercial fishing. And so you're trying to protect that resource for being still able to get your kai moana for a marae event. So this is just a mātaitai on South Westland in a place called Bruce Bay. But if you can go onto, you know, the MPI website, and they'll have all the different mātaitai around the country. Oh yeah, that's me taking a photograph of it on our very long trip down South Westland. And then some of I've just noticed iwi are involved, getting more involved. This was something I found, a good kai project where people are starting to do the whole food box thing. And I was really interested. This was a food box by Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, Waikato Tainui, and Ngāti Kuri. So I think that yeah, it's really interesting, some of the different things that iwi are getting involved in. And I just noticed on this food secure communities from the Ministry of Social Development, this model, and I was asked to sort of think about systems. But I guess my question is, and I'm really pleased actually to meet Wayne this morning and to understand your role, and just how are the Māori responses being woven in to this model would be my question. Have I gone for, and that would, and perhaps that's a question for discussion. Kia ora. Was I 15 minutes?
A little over, but it was worth it. Thank you so much, Christina. That is, I think, the question that you just posed, how are Māori responses being woven into how we're thinking about achieving food security is a great question for our groups to go away and think about. So I think we have everybody back now. So I'm just going to introduce our final speaker, who is Professor Louise Signal. Louise is the Head of Department of Public Health at the University of Otago Medical School. Oh, sorry, she's the Head of the Department of Public Health in Wellington for the Otago University. I've kind of mushed that a little bit, sorry, Louise. She is a social scientist whose research focuses on identifying and addressing environmental determinants of health, and she's quite particularly interested in health politics and health equity for Māori, Pacific and low-income communities. So, kia ora, Louise, I'll hand over to you.
Kia ora koutou, ko Elma taku mama, ko Lyle taku papa, ko Rangitikei te awa, ko Ruapehi te Mona, ko Louise Signal taku ingoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much, Barbara, for asking me to speak to you today about our work that we did, which we started, we were asked to do in 2008, if I recall correctly, by the Ministry of Health, and that was during the Helen Clark government. And this was work that was led by Cleona Niwuruku, who I think has been or may still be on the group, and Christina Mckercher was a key player in that work as well. And I had the privilege of leading some of the qualitative work in that piece of work, and have a few papers that came out of it, that one in particular that caught Barbara's eye. And so I was really appreciative of the opportunity to kind of revisit that work, because I have quite a lot of broad interests, but I do really see this issue of food security as being fundamental to our obesity epidemic here and across the world. And it was wonderful to have to relook at it and think about whether it was still useful. And the great tragedy for us with that piece of work, as often happens in politics, is that the government changed while we were doing the work. And it's true to say that the work fell on deaf ears. Looking at food security for Māori, Pacific and low-income New Zealanders was not something that the John Key-led government was interested in picking up on, and we got absolutely no traction. But we did do some papers, as I said, and maybe it's time to dust it off, and perhaps we should, the team of us should look to thinking about whether we could do a kind of a pithy update. But anyway, let me walk you through what we did do, because I think Barbara was interested in the way we did the analysis, and that is that we used a systems-based approach to our work. So hopefully that just gave you a quick moment to start thinking about the kinds of influences on food security or food insecurity. And this is the aim of our research, to look at food security for Māori, Pacific and low-income households. And it was funded by the Ministry of Health and the Health Research Council. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So the methods we used were to look at the literature to try and understand what those environmental influences were on food security. But we recognised that we didn't have very good data from New Zealand about Māori, Pacific and low-income people in this country. So we ran focus groups, one of which Christina was speaking about earlier, trying to understand where those kind of key intervention points might be for us in terms of food security in the space. We then identified interventions in relation to those intervention points in 3 workshops with a wide range of key stakeholders. It was a really useful way of progressing to then try and think, okay, so these are the sort of intervention points. What are the sorts of things we need to be doing in terms of interventions? And came up with this list of potential interventions, which we then evaluated. And I'm just going to talk about 2 of them today. They may not be the 2 most significant, but they illustrate the point. And we used literature reviews and then further key informants at that point. And this is the work that Christina was referring to in the traditional Kai space. So that then gave us a portfolio of policies, programs and actions that the government, we could advise the government they needed to take if they were really to have a systems approach, a comprehensive systems approach to food security. Next slide, please. So I've just asked you then to think about that for yourselves. And so then let's look then at what we discovered. Next slide, please. So when we look in the literature, we found a kind of 4 areas that seemed a good way to think about it. And in using that framework, it was the Angelo framework that Boyd Swinburne and others were involved in developing, which looks at a sort of a grid framework for thinking about factors on obesity, but it seemed also to fit here for food security. And they were economic factors. So you may well have come up with plenty of these: people's income, employment, expenses and debt, the welfare system and whether it was adequate, housing, only more significant now, of course, here in this country, and physical things like people's own health, their household facilities, whether they had kitchens, cooking utensils and so on, whether they had transport to go and shop, gardens, whether they live rurally or locally, urban environments, and whether their social and cultural context, skills and time, their family, their cultural expectations, their community, their pride or stigma around, say, accessing food banks, for example, issues of immigration and people coming here from other cultures with different food eating patterns and not necessarily able to access the food that they want or are used to. Food advertising, obviously, an issue I've been interested in. And then much of these things also have a political frame that you had to sort of draw out, but things like our rate of taxation, whether we have GST on food, which we do, our welfare policy and policy more generally, were the kinds of things that were coming up. Next slide, please. So the focus groups, it was very clear in talking to people from the communities that there was a desire for better access to healthy food. As somebody said, it's all just too hard. The barriers they talked about were money, knowledge and skills, habits, time, availability, cultural aspects of unable to get the kinds of food that they wish to eat, cost of taro in Auckland. Supports were increased money, reduced cost of healthy food. We have a very high cost of food and a duopoly in the supermarket industry. They needed increased skills and knowledge, and gardens were seen as very supportive. So again, the people were saying very much about solutions at multiple levels and across the board. Next slide, please. So we tried to triangulate or pull together that information from those various sources and take a systems approach, identifying those key places, or what systems theory would call control parameters, where intervention could work to create a more system-wide change. So you might be able to do one small thing on the side, but it might not ripple or have wider ramifications, but there could be some things that indeed make that difference. And I'm thinking of, today I would say a living wage and benefits that are a living benefit, for example. Next slide, please. So we produced this paper, which I would refer you to, which is called Tackling Wicked Health Promotion Problems, a New Zealand case study. And we used the example of food security in this. And so you can go to that to see how you might use this. And I think really Barbara was thinking that this might be, something that you might find useful to kind of think through this wicked problem of food insecurity in Aotearoa. Next slide, please. So this is a very complicated picture, and it is in it's in the paper. What I want you to do then is just to look at the boxes that are in the squares with the black lines around them. And so that is looking at the food, at those kind of control parameters, or those key places where you could intervene. And the first is food purchasing influences. The second is the money available in households. The third is the cost of healthy, nutritious food. And what we did was then try to map onto this the interventions that would be appropriate based on the feedback we had from the focus groups, from the further research we did, and so on. And you can see that these particular control parameters or points of intervention have quite a number of different interventions feeding into them. So if we look at the money available in households, food and schools is one of the things that we mentioned there. You can see in the box on the side here, I think my mouse should be, is my mouse coming up, Dan? So you can see food and schools. Now, I mean, listening to Sarah again, I just think to her wonderful work and that really impressive finding about how that's different people who are food insecure at different times, which means our numbers are way out, aren't they, Sarah? And it'd be great to understand those numbers, get that big ugly number for the Minister of Child Poverty Reduction, who is, of course, our Prime Minister. Another one here was fringe lender responsibility. So the loan sharks. There's a lot of current initiatives, some of the things that Christina was showing, which were very helpful, and so on, increasing the minimum wage, which we've seen some progress in, but not much. We've still, the full benefit entitlement, or making sure that more than full, actually, I would argue now, that it's a living wage. And tomorrow we've got an article coming out in the New Zealand Medical Journal, a group of us who talk to beneficiaries. It's called Life During Lockdown, and it really highlights the issues for beneficiaries, and food insecurity is a major issue. So you might just want to have a look at that. It'll be out in the morning. So a complicated picture. There's other control parameters that we looked at as well. We tried to think about them in terms of whether they were economic or physical or social or whatever. And so certainly you've got that big economic one there around the money available in households and also the cost of nutritious food. Next slide, please. So just focusing on those three, moving on again, thank you. So we did literature review and key informant interviews and developed policy papers in a wide range of areas. So in that first one, money available in households, we published a paper on loan sharks, which I want to talk about. But you see the provision of food in schools was there then. So, and at the moment they've still got a pilot going, but I think we have to do it. We have to do it. I mean, we're way out of step with countries we would compare ourselves to and not having high quality nutritious food available to children at schools. But there are other issues. And then in food purchasing, we talked about iwi development. And again, then in the cost of healthy, nutritious food, we talked about community-based initiatives. And I just want to pick up on those ones in the next slide, please. So fringe lenders, as you know, are, go around poor communities. There's payday loans. We've made some progress in this area, but at the time we were doing the study, people were paying about 400% a year for payday loans, which was even at the time outrageous. And that they told us they were borrowing for everyday needs. This is work that Doladia Lanimata was instrumental in doing, and that it results in significant debt and debt dependency and stress, of course, and of course food insecurity. So we argued for regulation of fringe lenders, access to affordable credit, and financial literacy for users of fringe lenders. Next slide, please. So the paper we wrote was called Punching Loan Sharks on the Nose, Effective Interventions to Reduce Financial Hardship in New Zealand. So you can look that up. That's the reference to it there. As I said, we've made some progress, but we're still way behind Australia. They've got a 35% cap on payday loans, on loan sharks. We still don't have anything remotely like that. Chris Farfoy was making some efforts in that direction, but I was so disappointed that he just didn't, really leap forward on it. So again, something I think that it's got low political costs for the government, but would stop wasting benefits on and people's hard-earned salaries in this terrible cycle of debt. Next slide, please. And then in terms of iwi development and food security, Māori, as we know, experience high rates of food insecurity, more so than non-Māori, and these are also influenced by higher unemployment rates, low educational obtainment, or the failure of the education system to teach Māori well, and low incomes. And the workshop participants suggested increasing iwi and other pan-tribal economic development in traditional food sources as possible interventions. And so Christina and I mean, Christina led this work, and she and I explored how this might play out, and she was very clear that there was two ways that this could work. It could both increase the food supply, that is, if you could access development, but it could also, you could access traditional food, but also that it could create jobs. And we've certainly seen that in the treaty settlements, for example, with Ngāi Tahu and the fishing rights and so on. But huge places we could go here in this kind of space, I think. Or Christina feels, an area for further consideration and research, really, and great to see your talk, Christina. I haven't heard you put all of that together. I think there's so much in that work that you've been sitting on, and I look forward to further work from you. Could I have another next slide, please? So again, that's Christina's article and the reference. We'll make the slides available later so you can follow up. Next slide, please. So just to conclude then, I think it is outrageous that our children are food insecure. I think it's outrageous that anybody is food insecure. This work here on Enhance was not particularly focused on children, but I mean, it is galling to hear Sarah's presentation. And we could lock down, we could solve that problem. What would seem to be the most impossible thing. I remember when they locked Wuhan down, and I thought, my gosh, they locked the whole city down, 12 million people. How could that be? But, you know, it's possible to imagine the impossible now. But systems theory would say that just as there is no one cause to such wicked problems as food insecurity, likewise, there's no one solution. We need multiple interventions designed to impact across the social system from which food security emerges. It needs to be across a range of physical, economic, political and socio-cultural factors, in our view, and the views of the people that we spoke to in the research that we did. It needs to be everybody. We all need to step up. Government, iwi, pan-tribal organisations, I think they are actually doing outstanding work, and we certainly saw significant leadership from Maori during the pandemic, during the lockdown, in terms of food security, for example, but in many other ways as well, social support and others. And we need, you know, community and I was going to put a question mark by the food industry, but I think we need the food industry we need a major. They need to change their game. We need to find ways to sell healthy food and not sell products that aren't even food in the guise of food, you know, junk food. We need strong government leadership in this space. And while Justine doesn't have a difficult time with COVID and done an incredible job, in my view, and also the view of the people we spoke to in our study, I think that we need to value our children. We need to see that it is utterly unacceptable to have any child be hungry. So I would conclude to say that we need to ensure that the rights of all New Zealanders are enacted, enabling them to be food secure and live long, productive lives in good health. Thanks very much, and sorry for the technology.
Thank you so much, Louise. And we all had those technology glitches. So it was great that Dan came to the rescue and we worked it out. So, and it gave us time to pause and reflect on what are those things that are in our minds and see how they connected to what was in your diagram, which I think really did show the complexity of the challenges, but also the opportunities. So it now falls to me to try and make a little bit of sense of some of the themes that have come out of the breakout discussions. And I just have to say there's just been a huge amount of really thoughtful and amazing sort of things that have come out of that I think I really probably can't do justice. But I thought I'd say a little bit more about some of the points that people have made around the data, and then also talk about some of the observations and things that have come up around the issue of food security and how we think about the problem, and then also how we respond and what are the ways in which we might need to think about the actions that are needed to move towards a more food secure New Zealand. So on the measures side, there was quite a bit of discussion about the fact that we have these lacks and inconsistencies and complexities in the data, and do we need to do more to get a better measurement system? On the flip side, there was also, I think, a view that we've actually got enough data. We know that there is a problem, and we actually just need to act. So while we do need to get better at measuring and understanding, that's not an excuse for an action. We don't need to wait until we understand the problem better to respond. So that's probably my very brief wrap up of the measurement discussion. And one thing I would say is that we will try and capture the key points from the breakout discussion and feed those out to people, so we don't lose it. On terms of the problem definition, I think a lot came out here around the complexity of the factors that contribute to food insecurity, and also how fragile a lot of people's situations are, and things, it doesn't take much to tip people in to food insecurity. So I think Sarah's presentation really highlighted that. So the other thing really, I think, is the connectedness of those factors. So the complexity and connectedness of transport, and do you have food storage? Do you have food cooking facilities? What traditional food sources do you have available to you? There's just what knowledge and skills do you have? What resources have you got available in your community and within your household? I think a lot of discussion around people just being outraged at that we have this. So the things that came up really were it's nonsensical that we have this, I think was a word that Christina said, given how much food we produce, and it's just unacceptable as well. So, it demands action. There was quite a bit of discussion around the fact that this is quite a racialized issue, but also often individualized, so that there's a bit of a blame culture in this space, and how do we move away from those two things? And in terms of the systems thing, one question that was posed by one of the groups is how do we change a self-perpetuating system? There are so many things that are in place in the current system that serve to maintain it. So how do we break through those? On solutions, Louise talked about the economic, the political, the social, the cultural, and the physical dimensions, and there was a sense that we have to act on all fronts to achieve change. A lot of discussion around things that need to happen at the community level, at the national level, and also the global dimension of this and climate change, and very much about how we redress the harm we're doing to both our environment and to our people, and using our solutions to do that. A lot of ideas coming up about solutions needing to be community-led, being done in partnership, letting Maori lead solutions, and an enormous amount came out of Christina's presentation, I think, about the things that are already happening and how do we build on and strengthen those and get out of the way. So an example people use was food safety regulations that just get in the way of people being much more self-sufficient. We need to connect people to each other and to the land and traditional food sources. I'm just seeing what else. So both reconnecting people and valuing those traditional practices. And I think a sense that it's Pākehā as well as Maori who have lost sight of some of those traditional ways of accessing and preparing and sharing food. So there are a range of actors at that system level, and I guess one of the issues is how do we make sure everybody's playing their role, the food industry, the regulators, policymakers, community leaders, local government. There's a lot that we can focus on as we identify these solutions. I'm not sure how to wrap all that up, but what I might do is pass over to Trish to talk about some of the things that we are really keen to progress. And then Wayne will do a karakia whakamutunga just to close this event. So thank you so much for being with us.
Sure, Barbara. Again, thank you to everyone for participating. Thank you to our three wonderful presenters. It's been incredible to be stirred by you, but also to find the places where we find that sense of connection and hopefully some sense of collective voice. I saw one of the groups throw up a question around, is there a way for some of the academic community to actually be a form of advocacy in this space? And that is definitely one of the hopes that Kore Hiakai has. When we got into the space, Kore Hiakai have only existed for 18 months, so we're pretty new in the space, and we'll only stay here for as long as it's helpful. And we're not here to kind of cement ourselves in anything. We're here to help and to find pathways for conversation and for change to happen. But we look to the academic community to say, surely there's some really good stuff here, and there is loads of really good stuff, but we couldn't figure out how to draw it together. So that's one of the reasons why we decided to hold this symposium today. And so one of the actions that will come out of that is that you'll receive a follow-up email. In there will be a Google form for you to go into and to tell us what your field of expertise or your field of focus is, what publications you may have already done, and then what you might be working on in the future, or what you might hope to work on in the future. And so that for us will help us bring together a really comprehensive database, if you like, of what is actually happening, because we've kind of felt like we've had to stick our head in several different rooms to kind of start to listen well and find out what is going on and figure out how these things might be woven together. And part of our hope for that is how could we then create a sense of advocacy across all those things, across all the disciplines and places of thought leadership as we go forward. So there'll be some questions in that Google form about whether or not you want to keep participating or want to be connected as we go forward in that way. We have a little hope that we might actually hold a physical event perhaps in 2022, where this might be a much longer and more extensive, kind of more able to dig richly into these ideas and actually start to form some solutions, and hope to have some decision makers perhaps in that room as well. So you might even want to let us know if that would be something that you would want to be a part of and want to contribute to. And Kore Hiakai is doing some tentative research. I kind of hesitate to call it research because I know that it's not academic research, so I kind of will do whakamara on my part, but we're tentatively doing some research around what does food secure look like, not what does food insecure look like. What are the factors in that means that we could use that as a test within communities of how to build food security rather than mitigate food insecurity. And one of the really interesting things that's come up through these themes today is that land and land use, colonisation, decolonisation are crucial to that conversation going forward. So that's a piece of work that we're doing. Again, if that's something you feel you could contribute to, we're very happy for you to let us know that. And as we end our day together, here, we hope that some of this has fed you mentally, emotionally, and even maybe socially as you're connected to people at this time when we pause in our year to really join together and acknowledge the richness of our communities at Matariki, and that we acknowledge those who have forged this for us in the past, and the role that we have, the responsibility that we have to lay the pathway for our mokopuna going forward. So I'm going to hand over to Wayne to give us our karakia whakamutunga.
Kia ora tātou, he mea kia koutou kua tau mai ai ki tēnei hui, kua tau mai te wā te whakamutunga, me karakia tātou. Ka whakaari e te tapu, ka wātea ai tāra, ka tūriki, whakataha ai, hume e, hui e, tai ki e. Kia ora tātou.